I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon. This is episode number 195, and today we are back for our final Rut Radio episode of the 2017 season, and we're recapping what types of things we learned, what were the themes and trends from the past season, and we check in with hunters from across the country to get their perspectives too. Alright, welcome back folks to another episode of the Wired to Hunt podcast, and we are here today with our final, well, you could say it's our first Rut Radio episode of 2018, but it's also our final Rut Radio episode of the 2017 season. It just so happens that it's in the new year, and today, you know, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take a high-level look back at the year, at the season, and at the different trends, and, I don't know. We've each week over the last 3 or 4 months now, right, we've talked to different hunters all across the country about what's happening in the whitetail woods, what kind of activity they've seen, how the conditions have been impacting deer behavior, what types of tactics have been working, and we've done that week by week by week by week. And that's been interesting to follow, you know, on a short-term basis. But I think if you pull back and look at this from a 30,000-foot overview, there's some interesting things we can learn from that as well, looking at the season in its entirety, I guess. And that's something I think we can learn from and then apply to the next season and future years. So that's kind of what I was hoping we could do in today's episode. And, of course, Spencer Newharth, of course, is with us. And, Spencer, you have been doing an awesome job all season putting these episodes together. So I just want to first off thank you for taking the time to do this, for connecting with so many different people and getting their reports and insights on what's happening. I can say personally I've gotten a lot from this, and I know our listeners have too. So well done, my friend.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mark, and I enjoy making these, and so I hope people enjoy listening to them as much as I enjoy producing them.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on today's episode? What are we going to try to achieve here?
Well, as you mentioned in the past, all of our reports that we received have been very immediate, looking at what's happened in the last 7 days and looking at what's probably going to be happening in the next 7 days. So this episode is obviously very different when we step back and look at the themes for the 2017 season. And so there are 5 things in particular that I picked up on, kind of ending the season. This year we covered 33 states for Rut Radio. I believe it was about 57 total reports over 14 episodes. And so within all that, there was about 5 things that stuck out to me, and those 5 things all happened to come up in today's episode when reflecting on the fall of 2017.
And actually, Spencer, real quick before you jump on those, just so that our listeners know what's coming up too, right? It's not just you and me talking today about reflecting on the season, but we also have some of our guest reporters back to reflect on the entire season as well. Is that right?
Yeah, and kind of the same idea is covering the whitetail nation. And we started in Nebraska and talked to Bryce Lamley from Sitka. Then we go to Illinois and talk to Alex Gilstrom from Whitetail Properties. And then in New York from QDMA is Matt Ross. And then we talked to Tony Peterson in Minnesota with Bow Hunter Magazine. These guys have hunted all beyond the borders of their states as well. And so bringing in these four kind of helped us get a wide view of the entire whitetail woods in the U.S. And so those 5 themes that I had mentioned previously, one of them being the EHD recovery. And a lot of the U.S. was hit in 2012 with EHD, and kind of we're still feeling the aftershock of that. And it varies. In the Dakotas, I feel like our deer numbers are back. I wrote a blog post on Wired to Hunt, I think a year ago, saying how this could be the glory days, that we always want to talk about and reflect on, because right now the age structure is starting to develop again, and we're seeing a lot of deer who have never been pressured before, because with that EHD, you get typically a big cutback in tag numbers. There's less hunters in the woods for the period of time after. And so what I've seen is that a lot of deer just haven't been educated yet in my area, because there isn't a ton of hunters out there chasing a ton of deer. And so we'll talk about the EHD recovery today, and both sides of the coin. Nebraska, Bryce didn't feel like they're seeing as well, where Tony, who hunted the Dakotas, feels like those populations are really starting to come back. And then we move into October, and this year I recall in the last couple weeks of October that there was a lot of optimistic reports, and the number one thing to attribute that to were the cold fronts that seemed to hit all the right notes. And Alex had a quote, something like this. He said something, if you were to pick out a calendar and circle the dates that you wanted a cold front in 2017, it felt like we got that this year.
Yeah. On that note, if I can jump in, I kind of thought the same thing. Like, I thought, oh man, we're getting just the gift of all gifts as far as the right weather at the right time. Because at least here in Michigan and Ohio, we had this big cold front that hit like October 24th or 25th, where it dropped like 20 or 30 degrees or something. I just thought that was going to blow the doors off of things. And we did get that weather, which should have been great. Now, for my own personal experiences, though, I didn't see the increase in activity that I was expecting to go along with that front. Now, of course, we can't make any big picture takeaways from just a single person situation from what I saw in Michigan and from Ohio trail cameras and stuff. But that was one thing that I personally experienced. It was the great weather, and then I just didn't get the increased activity that I was hoping for. And that even continued into November a bit because, as I'm sure you're mentioning here, that great October weather continued all the way through like early November. I can't remember a year that we've had better weather during the rut, at least in the places I was hunting. I feel like every year, at least for the last decade, when I've really been following this closely, during the rut, you always end up, at least for me, it seems that there always seems to be like a day or 2 or 3 or 4 where you get these abnormally hot temperatures, and everyone's bummed about it. 70-degree temperatures in early November, screwing up the best weeks of the rut. This year, at least where I was at, we didn't get that. We just had perfect cold to cool weather from, like October 24th straight on through November. I mean, you couldn't ask for anything more from that standpoint. But I also wonder, because of that, if we didn't have any huge drops, like relative drops, like it dropped October 24th, 25th, 26th, somewhere around there, into like the 40s. And again, this is where I was at. Of course, these temperatures might be different across the country. But if I remember right, temperatures just kind of stayed steadily cool for the next like 3 weeks. Like there wasn't any big ups and downs from that standpoint. And I wonder if that maybe, while I guess I'd rather have this than have a bunch of hot temps, maybe we didn't have those like huge bursts of cold front activity that sometimes you get when you get a 20 or 30 degree temperature drop, simply because it just kind of stayed steady at that point. And again, like I've said several times, that was just what I experienced. I don't know if you heard anyone else bring up something along those lines, but it was kind of an interesting weather year during the rut. Better, certainly way better than it could have been, but I wonder if maybe the lack of like big changes kind of led to a little bit of a stagnant flow to some of the rutting activity that we see. Does any of that ring a bell with you at all?
Well, I think bringing up that those cold fronts seemed well timed. If at the very least it gives hunters some confidence, and it'll get guys in the tree stand if they feel like they need to wait for a cold front. There was multiple, small ones, as you mentioned, that seemed to hit all the way from mid-October all the way to the beginning of November. And so if you were waiting on a cold front, you likely got to hunt one at some point during what you considered some good rutting action. And I've always considered that a potential factor in the past, why guys think that cold fronts are so great from hunting, just because maybe it gives them a little more confidence and it focuses you when you're in the tree stand, and maybe you pick one of your better tree stands on one of those cold front days. And it's not always attributed to the deer movement was potentially better, but you were just in a better spot and you were more focused.
I see what you're saying. So you're saying that maybe even if the cold fronts aren't impacting actual deer behavior, if nothing else, just because so many people in the deer hunting media preach about cold fronts, it just increases hunters' confidence and leads to better hunts because of that?
Yes, this is something I've been workshopping for a while, I guess. That if you see a cold front coming, you're going to be more confident that the deer movement is going to be there. And so, as you said, there's more guys in the woods. You're likely picking one of your better tree stands for that hunt. You're probably more focused because you're thinking, this could be it. And so I think we put a lot of stock into cold fronts and what they do to deer movement. And I think some of that is appropriate, but I think the other half of the coin is that guys just find themselves in better positions than they would be if, say, a cold front wasn't there. You probably wouldn't be in that stand because you wouldn't feel very good about the deer movement in that area.
It's an interesting observation. I think there could be some truth to that. I certainly love cold fronts. I think that there definitely is something to it, but you can't deny the fact that there is a ton of hype around them these days too. Like, especially with social media and all the media, just regular outdoor media now too. Like, I remember that that late October when that big front was coming through the country. If you looked at Instagram or Facebook or anything, there were so many people posting memes about it or all sorts of articles talking about better be in the woods. Heck, I made a YouTube video about it. There was all sorts of people talking about the front. So just the level of talk about these big things coming across the country that impact deer hunting these days. Like, I think there's a level of buzz about things, collective understanding about things that there probably was not 10 years ago. 10 years ago, nobody was talking about this stuff, at such a high degree where so many people are hearing about the same thing. So that's an interesting idea. I think it's something to think about. But I do love those cold fronts.
Yeah, I love them as well. I'm always going to be in a tree if I get a chance on a cold front. But I think what we have is potentially an echo chamber of everybody saying the same thing as you mentioned, the media, that you got to be there on a cold front. And then that just gets repeated and it becomes fact almost. And then I know you've discussed with some biologists how weather fronts affect deer movement. I believe Lindsay might have touched on this with you one time, that there's no science that shows that cold fronts affect deer movement. But I think he may have even admitted that goes against some of his deer hunting beliefs as well. And so, like I said, I think cold fronts appropriately get some hype, but it might be too much. There might be other factors involved there.
Yeah. Speaking of hype, one of the things I noticed this year is I was following the moon and the different theories around the moon and seeing how that tracked with my own observations. Now, again, you can't make too many claims or, what am I trying to say here? Just out of one person's observations, you don't want to take too much out of that. So what I'm about to say here, don't take this as fact across the board. This is just one person's observations, not even really data-driven. This is simply anecdotal. But I did try to track the different moon theories, the red moon theories, when the moon's overhead or underfoot, or if the moon is rising or setting early or late in the day, and seeing if that correlated with increased activity. So on the days when the moon was good, did I also see the activity bump that you're supposed to? And I can't say that I really saw anything noticeable. I didn't, go into those days and just get floored by, oh my gosh, yeah, this is incredible, and it was on those right days. But again, I wasn't tracking it so closely that I could say that, if I was really good about this, I would have tracked how many deer I saw per hour or something throughout the entire season, and then look at the days with the right moon conditions, and I could tell you, oh, well, on those days there was actually a 4% increased, sight rating or something like that. If I had that kind of data, then maybe we could pull some conclusions. I don't. But just from my general observation standpoint, it didn't feel like I saw anything different on those good moon days. And I've been tracking it for a handful of days. I'm still up in the air on it. Again, to what you said, Spencer, the research and science out there doesn't point to any kind of correlation. They have not been able to find a correlation. But there's a whole heck of a lot of good deer hunters that still believe it. So that's an interesting thing. But I realize I'm pulling things off the rail here, Spencer. I've totally taken you off of your mid-5 trends. So maybe we want to get back onto your track.
Yeah, so back to the 5 trends. The first 2 that we just covered was the EHD recovery and then the October cold fronts. The third one, keeping that October theme, was the huge acorn crop that it seemed like everybody was dealing with this year. And that was whether you're in Arkansas or Wisconsin or Vermont or Nebraska. There was just, everybody was talking about the acorns, and that could be good and bad. Some guys felt it was suppressing the movement in October, that you had to, work harder to find the deer, or others were excited about it a little bit later in the year. So did you see a large acorn crop in Michigan, or a lot of your contacts that you've talked to hit on that hot topic this year?
Yeah, I think that was something that I saw as well. And I think to that point, if you were hunting in a situation where you were kind of hoping for or dependent on activities on ag-related food sources or food plots, that's where the acorn crop maybe screwed things up for you. Because if you had like all of your early season or mid-October setups, over food, like a green food source or food plot of some kind, like I had a couple of setups like that. I had very little activity on those spots in daylight, especially mature bucks compared to past years. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to what you just said, that a lot of these deer, they didn't need to go out into the fields during daylight because they had food in the timber right next to their bedding, which just makes it more difficult. If you can't get in there, it's very tough to catch these deer in daylight. So yeah, I heard a lot of people mention that same thing, and I saw some of that as well.
Yeah, I'd say the acorns in October played a big role in how a lot of archers, whether they had success or not in 2017. So the fourth theme that I noticed was the late harvest as far as corn and soybeans. It seemed like we had a wet beginning of the year and then pretty mild temperatures that seemed to keep farmers out of the fields, and maybe some timely rains that kept farmers out of the fields as well. And that can change things on a whole number of different scales. I guess you could see deer that consistently stay in fields that never come out. I find deer in South Dakota that will bed in sloughs in the middle of a cornfield and you won't see them until harvest. Or that could be good for you if you have some of the only food around. So if you're dependent on corn or soybeans, you had likely had a late harvest this year, and that was something that you were always game planning around.
Mm-hmm. Definitely something that impacts things. Here, specifically in southern Michigan, we actually had early harvest. We had the crops coming out here earlier than I ever remember, but that could have been unique to just right where I'm at. But I saw like the opposite of what you just said, and that with the early harvest of the cornfields and stuff, lots of times that standing corn would keep deer in some of these areas that maybe didn't have good cover otherwise. So when those came down so early, in our case, it was like mid-October that these cornfields were coming down. That changed things up just a lot sooner than usual, because more often than not, I'm seeing, standing cornfields coming down, in the first to second week of November, maybe around here. And it was almost a full month earlier for me here. So that just changed things for me just in a different way. But yeah, the timing of the harvest, that's a big one. Whether it's early or late, you just need to stay on top of that if you hunt in an area where those things are happening.
Right, and like I said, some guys were fired up about it, and other guys were down on it. If you were a gun hunter and you primarily hunt a big open cut cornfield, and that cornfield wasn't cut, then obviously that made things difficult for you. But if you came upon mid-November and your corn hadn't been harvested, you're an archer and you had some of the only food around, then that might have been great for your situation. So the late harvest just played a role for everybody. It seemed like, whether good or bad.
Yeah, I always selfishly have always liked it when we get a late harvest. I always root for standing cornfields to still be standing on November 15th because that's our opening day of gun season. And I always feel like if you've got a lot of standing cornfields when gun season opens up, there's just going to be more young bucks that make it through to next year. I wish I could somehow track that to see if the rate of bucks that reach maturity the year after a late harvest year is higher, because I got to believe that those standing cornfields save a lot of young bucks if they're present. That definitely didn't happen for us this year, where I'm at least.
Well, and then the fifth theme is just the month of December and how the weather was then. It seemed like the first 15 days or the first half of December was fairly mild, and that was kind of frustrating and maddening for a lot of guys who rely on those good late season hunts. It didn't push the deer onto the food plots that it normally would. It didn't congregate them. It didn't push them into the winter bedding areas where they'd maybe be seeking some better cover. And so it seemed like the first half of December was kind of frustrating with the mild weather that we had for deer hunters, at least. And then the second half of December brought some harsher conditions, some snow, some wind, and some cold that did end up helping guys out. People were excited that their plots finally had some activity, or that their late season food source felt like it was being treated like a late season food source, as opposed to just a couple days prior in early December.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely felt that for sure. Super warm early December, super cold now in late December, which leads me to a question, which is, and I found myself in this situation in the past. Even this year, I was thinking about it a little bit. Right, it was early December, and I wanted to wait for a good cold front. But then I was thinking, as December ticked along, now it's the 7th, 8th, 9th, now it's the 11th, 12th, 13th, and you're waiting for this great weather. Well, what happens if it never comes? Like, at what point do you need to say, well, I just got to start hunting these late season deer because we're not going to get that mega cold front? So do you just start going because you can't wait because the season could just slip by? Or is the lesson learned from this year that, no, you should have stayed patient, because if you waited until the 20th, now you had this incredible weather that did get the big bucks all on the food sources in daylight, versus, if you had been pounding it on the 8th, 9th, 10th when it was kind of mediocre temperatures, maybe you would have pressured those deer, and now you don't get to see them when the really cold temperatures hit. I don't know. I found myself struggle with this in the late season every year. Like, how long do I wait until I start hunting? Because you want that perfect weather, but you also need to take some opportunities to get out there in the woods. But it's that balancing act, because you don't want to pressure them too much at this time of year. Did you hear anything along those lines from any of the other guys, or from your experience, Spencer, as far as, do you go for it anyways, or do you keep on being patient and wait till we do get that primo weather?
Nothing like that came up specifically in this episode, but just reflecting on who we talked to in the month of December, and it just seemed like a lot of selective pressure. And I remember talking to, it might have been Brett Joy in the Northeast here a couple weeks ago, and their season was like 3 days away from closing, and I think I asked something about how aggressive are you right now, and he said, well, there's 3 days of the season left, so extremely aggressive. So that seems kind of obvious there, that once it gets down to the wire, that you have to be more aggressive. But then I remember talking to some other guys who said, well, we have until January 15th, and so if we bump a deer now, that might be the last time we see him this season. So just a selective pressure, and I guess I don't know what the great answer is unless you have a crystal ball to see what the weather is coming. Just got to roll the dice with those hunts.
It really is about being selective, about picking the right times to go in there, and it's like you said, it's hard to know what's coming, but I guess that's why deer hunting is so much fun, because there's a lot of unknowns, and you gotta make decisions, make some assumptions, work off of them, and hope for the best, and sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. So,
well, those are the 5 things that I felt like really were the theme of 2017 across the Whitetail Nation. With everybody this week, I asked him if there's something that they felt like they picked up from this last fall that they can use going forward. Maybe a lesson that they learned in 2017 that they'll use in 2018 and seasons after that. So is there something you, Mark, that you feel like you learned in 2017 that was really eye-opening for you?
Man, There's a lot. But if I had to pick one thing to mention now, I'll be expanding on these in our next Wired Hunt podcast. But if I were to offer one thing right now, it might... what do I want to say here? Don't look at your phone too much. I'll keep it simple. No, in all seriousness, I think it's just been a season where, man, see, I still haven't collected all my own thoughts on things. It's still so fresh for me. A lot of my lessons learned this year were more related to my own personal situation, with my hunt for Holyfield, and that kind of consumed everything that I did this year. So I didn't necessarily get to have as many lessons learned outside of that one experience, because so much of what I did was revolving around that deer. So I do think that one big lesson learned I had this year was just about goal setting, and sometimes putting all your eggs in one basket isn't always as good of an idea. And I think doing what I did kept me from doing a lot of the other things that I think I would have enjoyed and would have made for a great hunting season as well, but I was so obsessed with this one thing. Now I realize this is not at all relevant to the rest of the audience who might be looking for some kind of really high-level deer hunting insight, so maybe I should just shut up and listen to what your observation or lesson learned is, because I'm sure it's more helpful than everything I've just been rambling about.
Well, my lesson learned from 2017 was it goes back to me killing that buck on September 30th, and I rarely have had much for early season success to to that point where I can kill a mature buck like that. I think one of the biggest things it was attributed to was just the complete lack of pressure that I had put on that property. As I said earlier this year, I got married in June, and then I moved into a new house in August, and so that really took away a lot of my opportunities to be out scouting and hanging cameras and doing things like that. And so I was just hunting some historical movement on that hunt, and that property hadn't had my boots on it since, I don't know, 6 months prior, probably. And so I think that just made a huge difference. Had I been there, multiple times hanging cameras or, coming in and out on a four-wheeler or anything like that, I can't imagine I would have had an opportunity at that buck. And so it just showed me that less is more for that time of year. It's made me rethink potentially using some cell cameras or, dialing way back on cameras in general, so I'm not tempted to go check them, September 15th and things like that. So it's showed me that you can have some success early season if you're just very, very careful about it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that's a great point. So Spencer, if you were to look back on the last 4 months of hunting, how would you rate the deer hunting on a scale of 1 to 10 for you?
For me, I really couldn't have asked for a better season, so it was a 10 for myself. Had the 166-inch buck in September, and then I killed a public land mule deer I was very happy with, and then a 140-inch buck in November. So I was very satisfied. When I put together my season, in the spring and summer, that's the kind of season I envision having, and so I couldn't have asked for a better year.
Do we want to move on to the rest of the people?
Yeah, we just rambled for 30 minutes, so we've doubled a normal Rut Radio episode. So I will talk to you in 2018.
Sounds good, Spencer. Thanks a lot for doing this, and thank you, everyone, for listening, and for those who participated, too. Just for me personally, I appreciate you guys working with Spencer. He can be a real bear to work with. So good stuff.
All right, thanks, Mark. Before we get to our first update, though, let's pause to thank our sponsors at Sitka Gear. For this week's Sitka story, we're joined by Sitka Ambassador Alex Templeton, who tells us about some exciting whitetail action from early November.
I had been hunting consistently all season long in Missouri with no luck. And at the end of October, I had the opportunity to go to Illinois, which came at a good time because the weather at home was really warm and the deer weren't moving at all. So after hunting a week in Illinois, coming home empty-handed, I was very determined to kill a deer with my bow before rifle season opened up in Missouri, which is on November 15th every year. At this point, it was the beginning of November, and the weather can be hit or miss this time of the year as well. And this is when the rut is starting to kick off at the beginning of November. So I had pretty high hopes for good deer movement. And after a couple long days and nights sitting on an evening hunt on my favorite farm, I had a clean 8 come by, and he offered me a perfect broadside shot. And I absolutely smoked him, and I saw him go down about 60 yards away from my stand, and I was super excited and pretty proud of myself.
On Alex's hunt, she was wearing Sitka's elevated 2 pattern in the women's line. If you'd like to create a Sitka story of your own, or to learn more about Sitka's technical hunting apparel, visit sitkagear.com. All right, and joining me on the line first is Bryce Lamley out of Nebraska with Sitka Gear. Now, Bryce, in Nebraska, what kind of a season did you have this year?
Well, pretty good. I had to work really hard. I hunted 76 times before our gun season and ended up killing about 120-inch 5x5 over a mock scrape in October, and then 2 days before rifle season killed a 136 inch buck right in the evening, just like I said, right before rifle season. But I had to work really hard for him, and the 136 was the second biggest deer I saw.
Well, Bryce, that sounds like a great year. And this past year, what are some of the big themes that you noticed there in Nebraska as far as weather, timing of the rut, things like that?
Well, one of the things is I don't think Nebraska, at least eastern Nebraska, has really recovered totally from the EHD epidemic we had in 2012. And we've had a little bit of a touch of it the last year or two as well. But 2012, we got hammered pretty hard, and it really knocked our numbers back. And we're still not back to where they were before that. And I don't know if they ever will be back, because I think the Game and Parks Commission felt some heat from a lot of farmers about deer numbers at that time. But deer numbers are still rebounding, let's just put it that way. Weather-wise, we had an extremely wet early season, and then it was like somebody shut the water off about mid-October or so, and it's been dry ever since. And I don't know if we've had an inch of rain since probably mid-October, and it's still very dry right now.
Well, Bryce, do the conditions from 2017 feel similar to anything else that you can recall in years past?
Well, one of the interesting things is we didn't get any. We had one snow, I think, in October in eastern Nebraska. It lasted 12 hours, and then we really didn't get any snow or cold weather until just right here at the end. The lake I live on, near just west of Omaha, Nebraska, is it didn't ice over until after Christmas. I mean, there were guys in their kayaks on Christmas Day celebrating that, although the ice fishermen haven't been real happy about it. But it was really mild temperatures, and I just remember one year, and I couldn't tell you what year it was, but we had one year where the first measurable snow was December 31st, and kind of a memorable hunt. I killed a doe that day, but it was just kind of like that. It was just an unusual year without a lot of precipitation throughout what you would generally consider to be the best hunting days and weeks.
Well, let's go back to talking about that moisture, and how do you think that amount of moisture that you guys received early season affected things then? How do you think it affected things come the rut and then ultimately late season?
Well, I think the amount of rain we had early on in some areas really helped define deer movement to some extent, because it made some areas, I mean, deer can get through it, but they're essentially lazy if they can be. And so it actually, in some of my areas, helped define the deer movement. But when it started turning dry, I think it really led to less scraping activity, if that's possible, because I didn't pick up as many or as much scraping activity that, in the prime time, last half of October and so forth. And as I usually do, and the ground was just rock hard in many cases. And I heard that from some of my buddies over in eastern Iowa too. They just kept saying, we need some water to get these deer to be more active in the scrapes. And so I do think it had a little bit of an effect there with the rut just a little bit. And our rut in eastern Nebraska, it depends on who you talk to, but for me, I hunted really hard all the way through about November 20th, and I was out of buck tags. And it was not there was never any really strong days where I was just like, wow, this is a circus. And most years I'll get some of that. Now I have a brother out in southwest Nebraska that hunts just as hard as I do, and he said it was crazy out there, a combination of whitetail and mule deer hunting. So I think it probably depends on where you were at, but I know in eastern Nebraska, myself and several others were a little bit disappointed in that.
Well, Bryce, you have a long resume of successful whitetail hunting with a bow. But in 2017, do you feel like that you learned anything new, or that the weather, or the rut, anything changed for you that really is something you'll apply going forward?
Well, I think one of our goals should be to learn something every time we hunt. And this year, I dealt with a property that had been basically 99% bulldozed, and it was just a pasture. There's no cattle on it, and it grew up in a lot of weeds. And so it was a learning experience for me, basically hunting a weed field. But I did have a lot of activity in there. Once the corn came out, there was a lot of deer activity in the weeds and so forth. And so maybe I'm getting a little bit of a feel for guys that hunt CRP quite a bit. I'm starting to get a feel for that, and maybe a newfound respect for that, because I was really depressed about what was happening to this property, but now not so much. And even after I killed my buck, I had a really close encounter with the biggest deer I saw all year, a 140, on that property, and I hope he made it. I think he did, and so it'll be interesting to match wits with him again. It's a little bit different type of hunting. They can see you coming a lot further away in many cases, but I think that there are some things you can do with a lot of grass and a lot of weeds, and I'm hopefully learning to adapt to the changes, I guess.
All right, Bryce. Well, great intel. Thanks for joining me, and good luck in the 2018 season.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Spencer.
All right, and joining us on the line next is Alec Gilstrom out of Illinois with Whitetail Properties. Now, Alex, in Illinois, what kind of season have you had thus far?
It's been a blessed one, man. I got to tell you, really good hunting from the word go. We had really good weather come in, really good cold fronts. Deer movement's been spot on. We had an awesome rut here in early November. I actually killed a buck on the 10th, and it was one of those mornings that we dream about. I mean, I was tucked in close to some security cover. It was up against the bedding area, transition line along the CRP. It was perfect, just in a kind of pinched down with this with the terrain as well as the cover. Created a really just kind of good natural funnel, and I shot the buck at 9:30 in the morning. He was the 11th buck that I saw that morning. It's kind of one of those, like I said, one of those ones you just dream about. So that was great.
Well, let's talk about that weather a little more. That it sounds like you think led to some of your successes this year, starting in October and then going into November, December. How do you think the weather affected buck movement this season?
I think it was really good in the area that I was hunting here in West Central Illinois. That's where I live. That's where I spent most of my time. And it was fairly mild, kind of throughout. But we had just, I mean, you couldn't pull up a calendar and point to where you want cold fronts to fall any better than what they did. I mean, it really was awesome to see that. And the temps fell at the right time, pressure was high at the right time, and the deer movement reflected that. So that was really great. And so overall, it wasn't like we had an unusually cold fall as far as general temperatures go. I would say it was probably fairly average here to slightly a little bit above average as far as the standard temperature went. But like I said, we had those anywhere from 10 to 20 degree drops situated in the right times. And by the right times, I'm talking, the last 10 days of October, we had a good one. And then the first few days of November, a little bit warm. Then it dipped off, I think, right around the 5th or the 6th, if I'm remembering correctly. We had another good front move in and made, the 6th to the 12th or 13th really, really strong. So it was awesome to see that. And like I said, it just kind of, you couldn't point on a calendar to have, I want a cold front during this time frame when, their daylight movement's really picking up and they're getting really active. As far as the mature bucks go, you couldn't ask for any better, really.
Well, from talking to hunters all across the nation this season, one common theme that I heard from everybody was acorns. And how did acorns play a role in Illinois and your hunting, and specifically?
Yeah, man, that doesn't surprise me that was a hot topic this year, just because It was. They were everywhere. I mean, it was nuts. It's always cool. You get excited whenever you see the white oaks. I mean, that's a year, at least, in the Midwest, especially in Western Illinois here. If you have white oaks, the deer just love them. They were loaded this year. It seemed like pin oaks and red oaks were really good too. I mean, if you had good oak trees, and they were definitely loaded up with acorns, there's no question. And I kind of had it's kind of a bittersweet relationship with acorns this year. I had one of my farms that I've got the privilege to hunt on, and I don't have any leases or anything like that, so I've got permission on a couple places, and actually hunt some public too quite a bit. So you kind of got to pick and choose your battles as far as that goes. But it's one of them in particular. It was loaded with oaks. Kind of had these two big ridges that run through the property, and they were loaded with oaks. So it kind of dispersed the deer a little bit because there were so many oak trees, and then so that made it tough. It makes it tough when you have that too. It makes it tough for access because the deer aren't, quote unquote, where they're supposed to be at the right times when you're trying to get in and out of the property. And it always seems like you end up bumping more deer just because they're kind of scattered out more, and it changes their patterns a little bit, especially when they're transitioning off of the early season food sources. But then, conversely, on the other side, I do have a piece of property where it's got a bunch of ridges that kind of come together, and at the point of where they all come together, that's where there's kind of like a concentration of these oaks are. And actually, that's the farm where I ended up killing my Illinois deer, and I was actually on one of the ridges instead of on the concentration point. I had hunted that a decent amount of times and hadn't had any luck, and moved off to a different ridge, and I'm only kind of guessing that's where he was headed, just in terms of travel patterns and kind of figuring out what they were doing on this particular farm. He was kind of headed to that, back to, and then they bed off farther away from it on beyond that center point where the ridges kind of come together. But he was definitely headed in that direction. And I attribute a lot of that to those acorns, because having that concentration of those oaks in that particular, and then you couple that with terrain features of the ridges coming together. It made for an awesome combination. I mean, we saw, like I said, the morning I killed my buck, there was, here in Illinois, that was the 11th buck I saw that morning, not to mention, a dozen does or so. So it definitely was cool because it concentrated the deer in that area. And then you top the pre-rut or the rut on top of that. It just made for really good. So I kind of saw both ends of that spectrum. But yeah, I mean, if you had a lot of oaks or a lot of acorns in your hunting area, it does not surprise me one bit that there was you kind of gave you a headache this year.
Well, Alex, what is one thing that you've taken away from this last fall, the 2017 season, that something you think you can apply going forward, or something that's really going to stick with you in the years to come?
Honestly, for me, I mean, I've always been a huge proponent of postseason scouting, and I've done it for quite a while, and it just continues to add more confidence and more success to each year. And I'm just going to do even more of that this year. I mean, when you can really go in the early spring before green up and shortly after snow melt, and you can kind of really start to put the pieces of the puzzle together on bedding areas and feeding areas, travel routes, buck sign in general, deer sign in general, it really can do wonders to really get a good understanding of how the deer are using this particular property you're hunting. And I'd say that, and coupled with one of the other really, really cool things I got to do this year was, and we're in Western Illinois, we're in hill country here. There's a lot of ridges and kind of rising terrain and a lot of differentiation between terrain. And I'd hunted that a little bit, just kind of sporadically in the past, but actually having a full season here since I moved here to really dedicate to understanding hill country hunting and terrain has been a lot of fun. I've actually really enjoyed just kind of how the deer, especially the mature bucks, kind of use the terrain to their advantage, everything from thermals and wind direction to just general travel patterns. It's been really, really cool from what I'm used to. I grew up in Southwest Michigan, and there just isn't much terrain there. So, kind of throwing that curveball into the mix has been a lot of fun this year. As far as HD goes, it's always a hot topic, especially the last couple of years here. And I feel like here in Western Illinois, it's what's historically known as the Golden Triangle. We were definitely affected in the 2012, die off. But now it's really exciting looking forward. Thank God we've had relief the last couple of years. We haven't been affected by it, but to see the age structure, anytime HD is kind of hitting that reset button, it's almost like, but To see that age structure really come back, I think the next year, and especially 2 years from now, barring any EHD disasters, I think we're going to see some of the best hunting that's ever been here, or at least similar to what it was in the late 90s, early 2000s, like everybody talks about. Age structures really come back, and it's been an exciting time to see, a lot of great 3-year-olds. Awesome for you. I mean, and then you're really getting, the quantity of mature bucks is certainly coming back too. So I think we're in good shape.
All right, Alex. Well, congrats on your 2017 successes and good luck in 2018. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Spencer. Same to you.
Before we get to our next caller, though, let's pause to thank our sponsors at Whitetail Properties. This week with Whitetail Properties, we are joined by Tom James, a land specialist out of central Indiana. And Tom is going to be telling us about what the very first habitat improvements should be for a land manager.
Good question. Some of the first key things, the fundamentals that you want to think about is when you think in terms of what a deer requires, the food, security, cover, and water. And the QDMA has a great analogy of thinking about the lowest hole on the bucket that you need to plug up to keep the water from leaking out. So what could be missing on your property that the surrounding land may have? And so you want to do a quick assessment. Maybe it's food, maybe it's water, maybe it's cover. If you can look through your woods and see 200 yards, then you've got an issue with too much shade, not enough sunlight, creating new potential browse and cover for your deer. So maybe it's a timber, either stand improvement or a harvest or a combination of two. That's going to allow some more new growth to come in and thicken up your property. Maybe it's as simple as you not leaving an area alone as a sanctuary. If you're traipsing all over 40 acres and pushing deer off every time you go, then that's obviously an issue. So maybe just an adjustment in the way that you move around and hunt the property and approach things. If food is your lacking ingredient or your lowest hole in the bucket, then even in timber, it takes some work, but you can certainly clear out some openings and plant food. And I would suggest considering both perennial food and annual food, stuff that you can leave in like clover and chicory as a perennial coming back every year, and do some fall planted cereal grains and brassicas for the fall time. So you've got a year-round program going on. And typically it's not an issue in the Midwest, but if water is a lacking ingredient, then maybe you can create a water hole or even some of the new systems like the Banks watering tanks that you can set up that are mobile and fill up and provide water sources for your deer so that they don't have to leave the property to water. Again, it's fairly rare, but that could be a consideration.
If you'd like to learn more and to see the properties that Tom currently has listed for sale, visit whitetailproperties.com/James. That's JAMES. All right, and joining us on the line next out of New York is Matt Ross with QDMA. Now, Matt, how has your season gone thus far in New York?
I had a great season. Our season typically opens, as most do, in early October, and it closes about the third week in December. And I got out a fair amount this year, more so than in 2016, so I chalk that up as a success. Harvested a doe with my bow pretty early on. I killed a couple does during rifle season as well. Pass on a lot of young bucks. New York State's one of those states that still has pretty high proportions of young bucks in the harvest, and trying to do my part and pass up some of those young bucks, and trying to shoot an older age class deer, and ended up without an empty buck tag, so did not take a buck this year, but I still had a very good season regardless.
Well, Matt, what are some of your big takeaways from 2017 as far as what are some of the big themes that you noticed, weather-related or crops-related or food sources-related or otherwise?
I'll tell you, at least where I hunt in the eastern part of the state, crop-related, there was a lot of corn standing late in the year this year. I think part of the process with farming in this part of the country, there's a lot of dairy farms, and it really slowed things down going into the mid part of the season. Obviously, with all that standing corn, the deer still the visibility of them a little bit limited. It certainly helped to a degree, but with some properties that may have been set up that way. So crop-wise, I saw acorn standing a lot longer than it had in the past. Weather was pretty standard, as in other years. I mean, there was no major events that threw things off. I'll tell you, rut-wise, though, the thing that I did notice was we did have a pretty good rut during the archery season in the southern part of New York. There was good activity, there was good chasing, a lot of daylight activity, and it seemed to trickle off and slow down right before our firearm season opened. So in terms of saving some of those young deer was a good thing. It probably changed the dynamics in terms of what deer were shot, but overall it was a good season. Nothing really out of the norm, though, for what I have experienced in the past.
You touched on some of the food sources in western New York with the cornfields. How about some of those natural food sources, the acorns, the apples, just generally in the Northeast this season?
Our soft mass production this year seemed like it was at a higher level from what I personally experienced and saw, especially apples. And from talking to other people, I think we had one of those years with the flowering and everything kind of working in favor and having a lot of apples on trees. I think it was like 3 years ago. We had a really crazy apple year. So in that sense, it seemed up. Acorns were spotty, though, and beech nuts. Hadn't heard any major regions, at least throughout the New England, New York area, where there was just a lot of acorns on the ground. That certainly can throw a wrench in your plans when it does happen. Spotty can be good, especially for setting up strategy, finding trees that are good producers and have a lot of acorns under them. And I personally did not capitalize on that, but I have a friend that really did capitalize and shot a couple good deer based on acorn production on some trees. So it was spotty this year in the Northeast as far as I could see.
Well, Matt, is there any big takeaway that you had from 2017, maybe a lesson that you've learned that you'd apply going forward into 2018 and seasons beyond that?
I enjoyed my 2017 season greatly, actually. I tried to take a little bit different perspective this year, enjoyed my time outside and not get too serious about it. I have found myself in the past, especially in the role I play with QDMA, to get, really intense about hunting, and I tried to enjoy my time afield this year in a little bit different mindset and going out there and just enjoying being in the tree. And that could also come with age. As I get older, I kind of enjoy that as well. One thing I did do this year was I have a close friend that's a forester as well as myself, and he's been asking and inquiring about hunting for a couple of years, and I really made time to take him out this year and get him his first deer, and that made my season. And I know it's a cliche to say it, but for the listeners out there, if you've ever had a coworker or relative or spouse's relative or somebody that is in your periphery that has shown interest, make sure you take some time out for them, because it really was an amazing experience getting my friend his first deer, and I really look forward to next season doing the same thing. I'm going to try to make that a tradition for myself to introduce somebody new every year.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a great thing to work on, not just for you, but for all hunters. So thanks for joining me, Matt, and good luck in 2018.
Thanks, Spencer. Thanks for having me.
All right, and joining us on the line next out of Minnesota is Tony Peterson with Bow Hunter Magazine. Now, Tony, I know you've been all over the Midwest and the Great Plains this year, and how has your season gone thus far?
Man, I had a good season. Pretty good, I should say. I killed 4 bucks and a couple does, all bow hunting this year. Most of them were on public land. My only hiccup this year was Wisconsin, which just absolutely kicked my butt. But otherwise, just had a really solid season.
Well, Tony, did you notice anything on the public land this year that was different than maybe most years, or something stuck out to you in 2017?
I would say what I noticed this year was a few more people. I don't think our hunter numbers are going through the roof or anything like that. So I think it just must be more people either hunting public land or taking these trips, similar kind of trips that I take. But I definitely had some company this year, and it felt like more company than usual.
How about your rut hunting? Was anything unique there as far as the activity that you saw or the weather you experienced?
The weather that I experienced during the rut, I spent about 9 days hunting northern Wisconsin, mostly on public land, and the weather was really cold, and the activity was guys on four-wheelers going out to set their bait sites up, from what I could tell. So it was just difficult. It was not, I did see some chasing, some activity. I saw a few really good bucks, just randomly, but nothing that ever just felt like it was clicking like it should during the rut.
How about the weather from the 2017 season, either early season or, up until now, late season?
Our late season here has been stupid cold, almost painful to go outside. I've been out trying to shoot a doe here in Minnesota, and it's really not that much fun. Early season, you get your weather swings, and the worst weather I probably had was in South Dakota, in your home state, when I camped in the downpour and hunted in the downpour for 3-4 days. That was probably the worst weather I had.
We've covered some diverse areas this year, from Wisconsin to South Dakota and stuff. What have you noticed with different food sources this fall?
I felt like there was quite a bit of food out there here in Minnesota. I hunted a few different properties throughout the state, and some places I hunted, especially southeastern Minnesota, I was around quite a few acorns. The acorn crop, the hard mass, seemed pretty solid. Up here where I live, just north of the Twin Cities, it wasn't nearly as good. We had a late corn harvest in a lot of places. That affected some things for sure. I think it affected the gun hunters more than anything, but it was definitely a factor. But it's the stuff that you deal with every year, in one capacity or another.
Well, spending a lot of time in the Dakotas, I know you were in some areas that were ravished by EHD in the last 5 or 6 years. What have you seen for deer numbers this year, as opposed to maybe 2016 or 2015?
South Dakota, I hunted South Dakota and North Dakota on public land in spots that had been hit by EHD, and I still thought the numbers were pretty solid. I don't think there's as many deer where I hunt in South Dakota as there was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but the population is still pretty good. And where I went in North Dakota, they've been hit by EHD randomly, a few times over the last decade, and I saw an awful lot of whitetails and quite a few mule deer, and the river bottom where those whitetails live didn't seem to be affected too much.
Well, Tony, you're one of the best whitetail bow hunters that I know, and I imagine having that kind of title that you're learning new things every year. Is there something in 2017 that you picked up that you think maybe you can apply to 2018 or other seasons going forward?
Man, I don't know if that title applies or not. If you'd have saw me in Wisconsin, I'm not so sure. But one thing I will say about this year, and I've talked about this quite a bit, is, man, I'm to the point now where I want to scout fresh sign and hang a newsstand every chance I can. And I'm just going that kind of old school route where you find a rub line, hang a stand. If it doesn't shake out, you move it. And that lesson is coming back to me hard over the last few years.
Well, Tony, good luck in 2018, and congrats on all your successes in 2017. Thanks for joining me.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
And that concludes this week's episode and this season's final episode of Wired to Hunt's Rut Radio. I want to thank our sponsors at Sitka, Matthews, Trophy Ridge, Yeti, Whitetail Institute, Whitetail Properties, Huntera, and Maven, and we thank you guys for listening. I also want to thank everyone who contributed to this year's episodes, all 57 of you who provided reports from New Hampshire to Louisiana up to North Dakota. You guys have made this podcast possible. So good luck to everybody as we transition into shed hunting and turkey hunting and summer scouting and everything else until I talk to you guys again next September. Until then, if you want to follow along with some of my other work, you can check me out on Instagram at Spencer Newharth, or you can see my website where most of my writing and photography lives, boothcommunications.com. I'll talk to you guys again in Season 3 of Rut Radio, but until then, stay wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. You ever get that feeling the walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating you? You crave some wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe in a spot all your own. Well, head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forests, mountains, streams, you name it. Search by acreage. You can search by location. You can search by the kind of hunting and fishing you're dreaming of. Land.com. It is where the adventure begins.